This webinar considers the linkages between reading experiences, attitudes toward reading, and positive reading outcomes. Our attitudes toward reading are important because they influence how much we read, how often we read, and ultimately, how well we read. My name is Amy Howley, Professor Emerita at Ohio University. Over my many years in education, both in K-12 schools and in universities, I have encountered quite a number of people who do not like to read. They have had negative experiences with reading and avoid it when they can. My experiences with reading have mostly been positive, although in elementary school I did have reading difficulties. Now, if you observe me at work, you'd see that I spend a lot of my time reading. And at home, because my eyes get tired, I listen to recorded books. Some people get pleasure from reading, but others don't. Because reading is so important to contemporary life, however, and because it can be a source of great enjoyment, it's important to help people take pleasure from reading and learn to do it well. Think about your own experiences with reading. Do you recall many enjoyable hours getting caught up in the story being told in a novel? Do you like to gather new information by reading books or articles or the material on websites? Or do you dread the idea of having to read something? Do you try to avoid reading even when reading documents or looking for information on websites is a requirement of your job? When you think about leisure time, do you routinely choose a sports activity or watching television rather than sitting down to read? And if your parents liked to read, they probably read books aloud to you. In some families, reading aloud is the last activity during the day, and children look forward to their bedtime story. In other families, oral reading of passages from the Bible is part of the daily routine. Our attitudes toward reading not only influence what we choose to do and how well we accomplish certain tasks that involve reading, they also influence other people. For example, we tend to communicate our attitudes toward reading to our own children, whether we try to or not. What we say and, more importantly, how we act communicates our interest in reading and our comfort level in performing activities that involve reading. For example, if we speak enthusiastically about books or magazine articles, our children will see that we take pleasure in reading. If we frequently consult newspapers, websites, or library books to find the information we need, our children will conclude that reading is useful. If we avoid looking at written material that comes in the mail or always choose to do something other than read, we may be giving the opposite message to our children. Our actions might clue our children into the fact that we see reading as an unpleasant chore, not an enjoyable pastime or practical skill. In a similar way, what we say about reading, and especially how we behave when asked to read, communicate our attitude toward reading to the students with whom we work. Although we are communicating unconsciously, we are still sharing our attitudes through our actions, words, and body language. What do people mean when they use the word attitude? Stop and think for a minute about what that word means to you. Both from a common sense point of view and from a more scholarly point of view, an attitude is a way of looking at something based on how that something makes you feel. Attitudes can be viewed as positive or negative, supportive or unsupportive, or warm or cold. But whether we call our attitude positive, supportive, or warm, we typically mean that we feel good about the activity, person, or circumstance about which we hold the positive, supportive, or warm attitude. Of course, we sometimes hear the expression, he has a negative attitude, or the expression, she has a positive attitude. These expressions relate to a person's overall disposition toward life in general. Most of us, however, feel positively disposed toward some things or activities and negatively disposed toward others. We hold a combination of different attitudes. Someone might have a positive attitude toward exercise, but a negative attitude toward housework. We often experience our attitudes in ways that are more complex than simply feeling positively or negatively disposed toward something or some activity. Some adjectives describing different attitudes are callous, critical, disdainful, jovial, gloomy, mocking, sincere, and reverent. When we talk about our attitudes toward academic activities, like reading or mathematics, though, we are more concerned with the general trend, either positive or negative, than with the subtle differences in nuance. Most people try to get more of the things or activities about which they hold positive attitudes, and to avoid the things or activities about which they hold negative attitudes. If you have a positive attitude toward exercise, for instance, you are likely to do more exercising and to become better and better at it over time. If you have a negative attitude toward meeting new people, you are likely to avoid parties. Where do your attitudes toward reading come from? In part, they come from your childhood experiences with reading. Through their words and actions, your parents and other adults who were close to you probably made you aware of their attitudes toward reading. If your parents liked to read and had sufficient leisure time to do some reading, you probably observed them sitting down with a book, magazine, or newspaper, perhaps on a daily basis or, at least, fairly frequently. And if your parents liked to read, they probably read books aloud to you. In some families, reading aloud is the last activity during the day, and children look forward to their bedtime story. In other families, oral reading of passages from the Bible is part of the daily routine. When families view reading in a positive way, they encourage children to keep at least a small number of books of their own, or to borrow books from the library. If they have access to the internet, they may show their children how to find information from websites that provide information, games, or stories, such as Wikipedia and PBS Kids. Although your early home experiences with written materials probably shaped your initial attitude toward reading, they were not the only important source of influence. Once you started school, your classroom reading instruction, visits to the school library, experiences with homework, and other activities involving reading all had an impact. If these activities were pleasant and led to meaningful accomplishments, they probably helped you develop or maintain a positive attitude toward reading. Your teachers may also have taken steps to ensure that you would enjoy reading and find it useful. They may have given you interesting books to read, encouraged your progress, and made you feel good about reading. They may have helped you see the way reading can link people, perhaps through exchanges of letters with a pen pal, or through group reading of Reader's Theatre scripts. Like many students, however, your school experience of reading may not have always been positive. Perhaps you had a teacher who seemed overly strict. Perhaps, like me, you took longer than other children to figure out what reading was all about and felt frustrated and embarrassed during reading lessons. Possibly you had a vision problem or auditory processing problem that got in the way of your learning. When a child experiences the process of learning to read as painful, his or her negative experience may contribute to a negative attitude. For many people, the attitudes toward reading they form during childhood remain with them for life. But others have experiences that cause them to change their attitude toward reading. One of my former students, for example, did not like to read as a child or teenager, but she became an avid reader when she was forced to stay at home, mostly on the sofa, as she recovered from a complex fracture of her leg. Another person I know liked to read novels during high school, but then started nursing school and soon began to feel overwhelmed and even bored by all of the textbook reading she was required to do. Although she may return to being a reader sometime later in life, the joy has gone out of it for her at this stage. You may be wondering why I'm dwelling so much on the way reading attitudes develop, so I'll explain. First, your reading experiences, attitudes, and behaviors serve as the foundation on which you will build skills as a reading tutor. Positive experiences, attitudes, and behaviors will make it easier for you to become a competent reading tutor, but negative attitudes may interfere. Second, you will inevitably, even if unconsciously, communicate your attitude toward reading to the children with whom you work. Third, there's no reason to get stressed out about the influence of any negative attitudes toward reading you might have. It's important to understand that your attitudes toward reading can change, even in adulthood. This point is especially important to consider if your experiences thus far have led you to dread or avoid reading. How can you communicate a positive attitude toward reading to the children with whom you work if your reading experiences have been frustrating and unproductive? How can you keep your negative attitude from rubbing off on your students? The best way to keep a negative attitude from influencing the children in your classroom is to change your attitude. Of course, you can try to hide a negative attitude from your students, but that approach won't be nearly as effective as the alternative, which involves taking steps to change your attitude. And the best way to change your attitude is to spend more time reading, especially reading written materials you enjoy. By spending more time reading, you will increase your confidence and your competence as a reader, and increased competence and confidence will soon have a positive effect on your attitude. Now that we've spent time talking about your experiences with and attitude toward reading, let's begin to devote more attention to students' attitudes toward reading. Not surprisingly, students develop attitudes toward reading in the same ways you did. What takes place in their homes is obviously important, but neither you nor the teacher nor anyone else in the school can control what happens there. So thinking about ways to give students encouraging and supportive experiences of reading while they are in school is what educators need to focus on. Think about some ways you could turn reading instruction into an enjoyable and productive experience for all of the students with whom you work. What ideas come to mind? Perhaps some of the ideas presented on this slide are ones you considered. Make sure students are working with reading materials that are neither too easy nor too hard for them. Give students honest feedback, but in a kind way. For example, you might tell a student something like this: "You are still having a hard time telling the difference between a B and a D, but we'll keep working on it." Provide students with stories and nonfiction that interests them. Allow students to talk about what they are reading and to relate it to experiences in their own lives. Throughout this webinar, I've emphasized the connection between attitude and behavior. A positive attitude toward reading leads to behaviors that support the learning process. When students have a positive attitude toward reading, they approach reading with the expectation that it will be pleasurable and that they will be successful. They also read often, choose a variety of reading materials, and talk about their reading with their parents and friends. Not surprisingly, these are just the behaviors that help